You're listening to the Cricket Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part 3 of the Cricket Podcast, where we're going to talk about the MCC's World Cricket recommendations about the future of international cricket. Now, we've overran on part 1 and 2, Max, so we're running a little bit low on time, but I can tell people to head over to patreon.com/thecricketpod to support the show directly. You get bonus content, and actually, I did a longer episode of basically this on there just for Patreon. So if you want to pay and hear more thoughts about the future of international cricket, then you can. And you can keep the podcast going while you listen. Max, I'm going to just run through the recommendations one by one, and we can give our thoughts. And they kind of bundle up in, some of them are in packages, but we'll just go down all 6. Do the first 2 in one. So basically what the MCC World Cricket Committee is a body of people who are mostly, it seems, ex-players, people with interest in the game. And they meet every few months to talk about the problems that they see in world cricket and to come up with ideas. They're like cricket's think tank or a cricketing think tank. Obviously, they're associated with the MCC, so they have a certain traditionalist angle on things. And their purview, if you like, is to think about the sustainability, particularly of the more traditional areas of the game, international cricket, test cricket. And that's where they're shooting from. This is what they came up with, Max, for the first 2, and these relate to men's test cricket, I think. First, a test match financial audit to identify nations in need of support to sustain a test programme. In other words, finding out how much it costs to host test cricket for each nation. And then 2, a test fund to support those nations and protect the sanctity of test cricket. So what do you make of those 2, Max? I've thought about this a lot, but I'll give you the first thought.
I think those 2 make perfect sense. I think they are very closely aligned to issues that are known around Test cricket and the problems with keeping Test cricket going. And it's like if you look at the Future Tours program, you got your 5 Test series. There's always England, Australia, England, India, India, Australia. And then every now, maybe South Africa get 2 tests or West Indies get 2 tests or whatever. And it's all related to the point about how much money it makes, how much money it costs. And an audit will be useful in terms of putting the data together, but you don't need an audit to know that Test cricket loses these places money, particularly when they're not hosting the big names who, will send people over in their droves to spend loads of money. So we know that's a problem and it needs fixing. So I think that makes perfect sense, and I'm supportive of the idea. It's essentially it's a redistribution of wealth, isn't it? Which is quite important given that England, Australia, and India have already taken all the wealth away from everyone else in the first place, and not given it back yet. So I think it's logical. The practicalities of it will be interesting to see how it ends up working and how sort of that the funding works, how the redistribution will happen. But it seems like a positive thing to me.
Yeah, I'd broadly agree with that. I think there are a couple of things I'd add. I really like the idea of a test fund. I think there needs to be more redistribution and so on in cricket in general. And I think specifically there should be money. Like if you host a test match, it should not cost you money to host a test match. You have to think about these things. And if you're from a major nation and you're of a particular bent, you might be saying, well, we make all the money. Why should we give it over? You have to think about these things from an ecosystem perspective. The test cricket ecosystem does not work unless there are competitive nations across the world that can come and can play cricket at Headingley or can go to Mumbai or wherever it is and play games. If they turn up and they get rolled in 2 days, the whole product dies. So
and then you can't make money out of it.
Yeah, how do you sustain that? Well, the first thing you do is you create a situation where it is not a financial burden to play and develop test cricket. I think it makes a lot of sense. How do you pay for that? I think it's basic redistribution, isn't it? We saw the pie chart of where all the money goes in international cricket from the ICC. There's plenty of money It's when we're not talking about vast sums. What the audit will show is that most test matches either break even for smaller nations, or they lose $1 million, maybe a couple of $1 million. That isn't much money in the scheme of cricket. I would actually go a step further, and I would say I would massively increase match fees for players in all test matches as well, like 5 times, 10 times. And I would include that in this fund too. So I would say if you play a test match for West Indies against Sri Lanka, it doesn't matter that you're playing a match that, globally speaking, doesn't have a huge audience and that you're from 2 small marketplaces. There is a recognition from the international cricket community that there is value in this being played, and that later that value will be realised in broadcast rights when West Indies play England. And we're going to make sure that West Indies, when they do play England, are prepared for that, because they have their best players on the pitch regularly and they're being tested regularly. And the way you do that is you
and they want to play cricket because they get money for it.
Yeah, and you make it lucrative. You make 2 test matches against Sri Lanka worth $30,000, $50,000 for every player that plays. And even within that, we're not talking about vast sums. If it was a £1 million a test split between both 11s and their 12th men and backroom staff, that would go quite a long way to making Test cricket, financially viable for those guys. And attractive for those guys as well. So that's what I would add to. The next 2, Max, I think pertain to women's cricket. So a substantial ring-fence fund to protect, grow and strengthen women's cricket. And 2, make it a requirement for any associate nation seeking test status to invest in and field a women's team. So I think the second one there, I think we both agree on. That's absolutely fair and should be normal. It's insane that wouldn't be.
I thought it already existed,
anyway.
Didn't it?
Yeah. Well, it does. And then Afghanistan is kind of a grey area, but that should absolutely be a thing. It's preposterous that it isn't. The substantial ring-fenced fund to protect, grow and strengthen women's cricket. What do you think about that, Max?
Well, I mean, the words are positive. It's very vague, isn't it? What you're going to do, what you're going to spend it on, how's it going to work? But, I mean, yeah. Growing women's cricket, developing it is obviously a positive thing. It's happening, obviously, in the English game and the Indian game, as those sides look to get closer to Australia. England, obviously, the women's 100. I mean, it's probably the best. It's the best bit about the 100, isn't it? That really put it on front and center, I suppose, in this country, and helped make it more visible. That feeds through to the internationals, the Ashes and that side of things. So I mean, maybe it's more focused on giving the other nations the capacity and space to be able to do that as well, which I think is possibly where women's cricket really needs to take the next step, doesn't it? At the moment, you've got Australia miles ahead. They went professional before everyone else, and they're reaping the benefits of that. England and India not far behind. They're getting closer, but they're still not quite there yet. And then below that, I suppose there's South Africa, who are, they beat England and India from reasonably regularly. They don't have a winning record, but they do win games quite a lot. And then maybe the West Indies around there as well. But it's below that, it's really variable, isn't it? So I think what women's cricket really needs to focus on, I suppose, would be just upping that level of competitiveness from the other nations, and that's what I think a fund should be focusing on there. I don't know if that's what they mean by that, because like I said, it's quite vague, but that would be my interpretation of what would need to be done. I don't know what you think.
I think that is what they're saying. I think there's a couple of things to this that I do wonder about. I think for the richer boards, they don't need this money. And I think if you create this fund, in a sense, there's the potential that you rob Peter to pay Paul. In other words, if you say that there is now a fund that the ICC will administer that will pay for the women's game, then the money that they would otherwise have allocated to it, they won't, because now they'll expect the ICC to pay.
Yeah, so I mean, that's what I mean when I say it needs to focus on those developing nations. Yeah,
I think at a developing level, I think that absolutely is true. But I would say that really applies to basically teams at Zimbabwe's level and below on the in world cricket terms. Maybe some of the others as well. There are poorer boards out there. I think the West Indies could definitely benefit from a few bob, couldn't they? So I think there's a little bit of nuance to that one. I think broadly speaking, it's a good idea, but it's one of those things that could go wrong, even though it's framed with the best of
I guess it'd be
intentions.
very easy, wouldn't it? Just be say, we want to make women's cricket better. Here's some money. Like you still need to think about how you're going to do it, and do that without just getting a consultancy firm in.
Yeah, exactly. Right, next, Max, we get to, these are kind of separate, so we'll do them separately. A more balanced future tours program across all nations whilst finding space for franchise cricket. Now, I actually don't understand what that means. I think it means, a few more test matches for South Africa and the teams that are currently playing 6 tests a year. But I don't know exactly how that works with finding space for franchise cricket and what the balance is there. I feel like that's a lot of buzzwords without any.
No, what they've said is a bunch of things that everyone would like to happen.
I think in essence that's a good thing. My take on this would be, you know what SMART goals are, right? Specific, measurable, actionable. I think this is the exact opposite of one of those. It's very not inspecific. It isn't particularly measurable. There's no actions to take. I would like to have seen them say something like 3 test match series in the World Test Championship, something that actually makes sense. They didn't. At least they're talking about it.
It's a div goal, Jack. It's derivative, immeasurable, and vague.
Oh, I like that, yeah. And then finally, removing bilateral one-day international series other than in the year leading up to 50 over World Cups. What do you think about this? Because I have some strong thoughts.
Yes. It feels a little to me like sounding the death knell for one-day cricket. I think it's really poor, because it's just, I mean, one-day cricket is basically what developing nations thrive on, right? They're playing it all the time to get into the World Cup. And if they're just playing each other all the time to get into the World Cup, and then they only ever play teams at the World Cup, then, where's the pathway to development, right? I mean, I understand the point behind it, I suppose, in that, especially when it comes to, like, you got a test series, then after that you have some bilateral one days, and no one really cares about it. And they say, all right, well, let's remove that and replace it with something else that'll be more interesting. But I think you can get rid of those if you want, but replace it with a better form of ODI cricket. Like, have some. I mean, remember there used to be like those tri-series tournaments. They were good fun. That kind of thing. I think what I would like to see in the one-day space is developing nations. Your Netherlands, your Scotland, maybe even your Ireland, if because I mean they're still trying to catch up with everyone. We saw in the World Cup qualifiers they didn't do so well. Get those guys together and play like a development side from England or India or South Africa. Like there's clusters, there's geographical clusters where this would work. Like the Netherlands, Scotland, England, Ireland, they could all play, and you could have an England side that's captained by someone. It could be a captaincy pathway for an England side. You could have someone who you think is identified as a future England captain manage this side of young, exciting, up-and-coming English talent against developing nations. It gives them an opportunity to play against high-quality cricketers in a competitive environment. It gives those developing players an opportunity to play for England in a competitive environment. Those sorts of things, I think, are things you could do to try and make ODI cricket more interesting for everyone. Just binning bilateral series is sort of doing the opposite, I think. But I think that, there is, I do sort of sympathise in a way in that there probably is something that needs to be done around ODIs between the big nations, because it does become a bit of an afterthought until there's a World Cup. So, I mean, I can sort of see an angle, but I think the way that they suggest going about it is quite bad.
Yeah, I think it is quite a bad suggestion in general. Part of this report, if you can read it in a bit more detail, is talks about how cricket is not inclusive and democratic. Basically, the one way that smaller nations can improve beyond T20 cricket is ODI cricket. There's no first class cricket in the Netherlands. There's no test nation. They don't have test status. So if you want to talk about inclusive and democratic, and you think that is one of the goals you aspire to, really that is your only tool besides T20 cricket to do that.
Yeah.
I get that you want to play more test cricket, and I understand that, but that if your solution to playing more test cricket is that you effectively, after the 8th best team, the current World Test Championship sides, you just pull the ladder up and you say, well, you can play the T20 World Cup every 4 years or 2 years or however often they hold that. You're not doing that. I think context is the important thing. I think they do play too much ODI cricket. I don't. And I think they play too much bilateral T20 cricket as well. And I think both of those things are a problem. What I would do is wrap them both up. And for both of those white ball forms, I would play more either regionalised tournaments, as you were sort of saying. And I think it doesn't have to be a development 11. Why can't England play a nearly full strength team against Ireland? They'll rotate bowlers, but they do that in bilateral cricket at the moment. The reason it has no value but outside of World Cup years is because half the team, everybody knows, aren't anywhere near a front 11. They're just nowhere near an actual World Cup team. So they are a bit boring, and they are basically development teams. If you're going to do that, you might as well package it up and play an actual tournament. And I think you can regionalise it in Asia, you can regionalise it in the European cluster, the south of Africa. And I don't think it's that hard to do. And in each one of those, you can invite other teams from different parts of the world in. It wouldn't be that hard. At the end of this summer, are New Zealand playing some ODIs against England? I think they are. It wouldn't be that hard if instead of a 3 or 6 match bilateral series, whatever it is, it was
a round robin.
It was New Zealand, England, Ireland, and Scotland in a tournament. Everyone plays 3 matches, and then there's a final. It's a pretty basic thing to do to give everyone some cricket. I get with that specific idea, there's the potential that you get some games with no crowds, but that's already a problem. That's already a problem. You're not solving that.
Yeah. But I mean, if you have, like, say you got New Zealand playing Scotland at the Oval, Headingley,
well, it wouldn't be.
I don't know, Durham on a Sunday,
yeah,
and so make it 15 quid, and like kids go for a £5, people will go. Yeah,
they will. They will.
Be fun.
I mean, England's a bit weird in that people will go to live sport more.
Well, that's true.
But I think that those sort of things have to be the future, or qualifying groups for the World Cup. The next World Cup is 12 teams, I think. Why are there not 2 groups of 8 or something like that, or 3 groups of 5?
Like football style, so where that.
Yeah.
England and Italy are always going to qualify, but every now and then they will lose to Montenegro, and Netherlands will sneak in.
In this world, say you have over the next cycle, whatever it is, next 3 years, you're in a group of 6. You play each team in your group 3 times. You can marry it up with the World Test Championship schedule as well if you want to do that. Where obviously where it applies. The best 15 teams in the world will play each other a lot. It will develop the worst 5 teams quite significantly. The teams in that middle spot will get regular cricket, so Zimbabwe, etc., will get to play England every now and then. And the top teams, they've got something to play for. They will actually have to turn up and try and win some of these games at least, otherwise they won't go to the World Cup. Yeah, that's the fact that West Indies haven't made the World Cup in a sense is really bad. But at the same time, we will all learn from this that cricket will go on, and that it isn't.
Also, I mean, from watching West Indies playing one days recently, I'm not sure I'm bothered about them not being at the World Cup.
Well, no, I don't think anyone is really. But yeah, anyway, this segment actually was supposed to have Q&A in it as well, but I think we've overrun a little bit, so unfortunately we're gonna have to call it a day. Thanks very much for listening to the Cricket Podcast. You can find us on socials at the Cricket Pod. The number one thing you can do to support the show, short of becoming a Patreon, though, is sharing our content with your friends and making sure you subscribe on 5 different platforms. Go through Apple and Spotify and YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Like them all there, and if you can't afford the $5 a month, that's a real benefit to us, regardless. So thanks very much for listening or watching, whichever your platform is. We will catch up with you relatively soon. We might have a couple of days off because there's no Ashes cricket this weekend. Bye bye.